what would be the role of the thyroid hormone in metabolism exactly? And hence, what happens when there is metabolic adaptation going on? What happens to this hormone specifically?
Yeah, so when metabolic adaptation is going on, when we're in a big energy deficit, when we're losing a lot of fat, we will tend to see the thyroid hormone goes down. And this is not because of an issue with the thyroid in the vast majority of cases. I mean, you could have a thyroid issue that's unrelated to what's going on, but this is all happening at the level of the hypothalamus. So it's not that your thyroid itself stopped working, it's that the thyroid is no longer receiving that message from the higher levels in the cascade that are saying, hey, we have plenty of energy, go ahead and make the normal amount of thyroid hormone. So we see that during weight loss, during energy restriction, we'll see thyroid hormone go down, and ultimately low thyroid hormone levels are associated with low energy expenditure levels because thyroid hormone stimulates proton leak, it stimulates ATP consumption in the muscle, brown adipose tissue activation, and other ATP consuming processes. So when thyroid hormone is high, it's stimulating all these processes that involve ATP consumption. And ultimately, like, the body's got a hierarchy of goals, right? And there are some that are non-negotiable. A couple things that we need that just cannot be negotiated are, we need oxygen and we really need ATP, right? So your body will drop everything to make sure that ATP levels are adequate. So when thyroid hormone is stimulating all these ATP consuming processes, the body says, cool, let's turn on all the metabolic pathways that help us get more ATP. So we start breaking down fat and carbohydrate to get more ATP, right? So when we see that thyroid hormone goes down, it's not stimulating those ATP consuming processes as much. And so then we don't have to break down all the extra fat and or carbohydrate to fuel those processes. So that's kind of a basic overview of why thyroid hormone would actually matter in this scenario and how it's impacted by weight loss.
Is that related to like metabolic efficiency in some case, or is that something different?
Absolutely. So, it's not the only thing that impacts mitochondrial efficiency, but it is a thing that impacts mitochondrial efficiency. So we talked about that a little bit earlier, but the idea is when I said that thyroid hormone stimulates proton leak, when you have a situation with high proton leak, you have very inefficient mitochondrial function. Same thing, I mentioned brown adipose tissue. It's not a major factor in the resting metabolic rate of an adult human. A baby, sure. Little mammal, yes. But for an adult human, it's not a huge factor. But we do see that thyroid hormone does stimulate the activation of brown adipose tissue. And one of the reasons that brown adipose tissue burns through calories at such a high rate is because there's a lot of mitochondrial inefficiency in brown adipose tissue.
When you talk about brown adipose tissue, especially in adults, where is usually that found within the body?
Yeah, so I actually published a paper about brown adipose tissue a few years ago. It was a fun project, and that was the question, where is it? And people had answered the question before us, but we were trying to look at, whether or not levels were different in athletes versus non-athletes and stuff like that. But, we did go through the process of imaging. You have to use imaging to really figure that out. But we did imaging to figure out where are we seeing some of this brown adipose tissue activation. And in adult humans, it's pretty isolated in clusters. And those clusters tend to be around the clavicles and around the spine, especially up in the cervical and thoracic region. So when you do the process of, usually you'll do some type of labeled glucose analog. You'll give that via injection. You'll make sure that the person doesn't move. You'll put them in a cold environment, and using imaging, you can see where the hot spots are, where a lot of that labeled glucose is kind of aggregated. And it does tend to be clavicle and then up in the neck area and kind of down the cervical and thoracic spine.
Okay, that's so interesting. Is there any reason that you found in that paper that why would that be the location for this particular brown tissue to be there and not somewhere else?
I've never really thought about why. I don't think I have a good answer for that. But we definitely see that it is certainly, it's universal. So from study to study, it's not like we found it there and other people find it, you know, around the knee or anything like that. It is very typically in that region. I would expect, if I had to speculate, I could be way off, but the function of brown adipose tissue is to generate heat. That's what it does in small mammals. That's what it does in babies. It just generates heat so that we can maintain a warm core temperature. I would imagine that proximity to the vital organs, the proximity to you know, a lot of the vasculature that carries blood to the brain. I would imagine it's just that's where we would most need some of those cells that are able to generate heat. You know, and we see the same thing with just general physiological core temperature regulation, right? So when we go out in the cold, a lot of the warmth that we do have in the blood, it, you know, comes to the core, right? Gets to the vital organs. We don't get as much blood flow to the skin, blood flow to the extremities, because we're trying to keep as much heat as we can near the vital organs and kind of our core. So I would imagine that's, if I had to guess, that, I'll put it this way. If I was designing humans, if I had a chance to do it, that's how I would do it. And that's why.
That's awesome. I think I loved your answer, even though even if you're not too sure, I think you are sort of a spot on. And like, it could be a good question for a new research. Like, why is actually the reason that the location of this brown adipose tissue is located in these areas specifically? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you had talked to me a few years ago when I was working on that project, it was like all I read about was brown adipose tissue. I probably would have had a good answer back then, but yeah, we finished that project and it was just kind of a single project I did in that area. I didn't follow up with more research on it, so I'm sure the answer's out there. I'd probably just
probably
into some of those old papers.
That's awesome. Now let's get into another hormone that usually tends to sort of go along the way with leptin, and this ghrelin. So what about ghrelin levels, and what about its effect when we're dieting?
Yeah, so ghrelin and leptin both have impacts on appetite regulation and hunger. And what we find is that generally speaking, when leptin gets low, that's associated with increased hunger. The same thing goes with ghrelin, but in reverse. When ghrelin gets high, we get hungry and we want to eat. And so ghrelin, of course, changes on a very short-term time scale. So right after a meal, we'll find that ghrelin is very low. And then as we go a long period without eating, ghrelin goes up and up and up and up and gets really high. And that's when we say, okay, I'm hungry, it's time to eat again. But ghrelin also reacts to long-term energy availability too. So okay. Ghrelin, you know, it's whether we're dieting or whether we're not, we're always going to have those ups and downs every day with ghrelin. But what we find is when we're on a diet, we're losing fat, we're getting very, very lean, we will find that the ghrelin doesn't just get high, it gets like really, really, really high. And so it ties into hunger. And what we see is that because of the hypothalamus and it's sensing this low energy availability, we see a lot of changes in several hormones related to hunger and appetite, and they all basically point in the same direction. That is, your body's sensing that energy availability is low, and you probably ought to eat. You know, the body wants to maintain energy availability within reason. So we see the ghrelin level go up just to give us a reminder, like, hey, it's probably time to get a calorie-dense meal.
Do you find that perhaps when we compare leptin to ghrelin, for example, ghrelin would be more a hormone that you could potentially manipulate in the sense of habitual or routine? When, for example, when you sort of get used to eating 2 meals a day, you're not missing breakfast, you generally don't feel hungry at the time. But if you start eating breakfast and doing a more regular meal eating pattern, you tend to start missing or be hungry for breakfast?
I would expect that's probably true. We can probably manipulate it and adapt to different patterns throughout the day. And another thing you'll notice is that whenever you go to lower meal frequency and you're eating fewer meals, throughout the day. Part of that adaptation might relate to changes in the pattern of ghrelin release and ghrelin accumulation in the blood. Part of it also is going to relate to the fact that when you go from 6 meals a day to 2, it's going to be 2 really big meals, you know. So there's a couple different things that could be going on there. But absolutely, I mean, when it comes to the end result, I'm sure we've all, anyone who's experimented with different eating patterns will tell you, you adapt to those eating patterns pretty effectively, which is great. But it does run into, it does make you run into some disagreements or arguments, because you'll hear someone who is totally adapted to eating only late in the day, and they're like, how could somebody eat breakfast? Who's hungry in the morning? And it's like, you used to be, but you forgot, you know. But back before you adapted to this particular eating pattern, you also had breakfast because you were also hungry in the morning. So we absolutely have the ability to adapt to a wide range of different eating patterns. And I suspect that ghrelin certainly adapts along with us.
Yeah. All right. Now, I have, I think I read something that you recently published in the latest issue of Mass about metabolic adaptation is an illusion. Why is this term of being an illusion going on?
Yeah, I saw that title when the paper came out, and I was like, man, I wrote like a really long article saying the opposite. So I might be extremely wrong here. I got a little bit nervous when I saw that, but you know, I mean, you look at the evidence, and if you were wrong, then you were wrong, and you put a nice little correction on the article. So I saw that title, that in the title it said metabolic adaptation's an illusion. I was like, wow, this is going to change my perspective a lot. But looking a little bit closer at the study, I really disagree with that contention. So what they were getting at in the study is that metabolic adaptation is no longer observed when someone is at neutral energy balance or when they're eating at maintenance calories. So they were kind of putting forward the idea it's only observable when you're currently in an energy deficit. But 2 important things. The first one is that they specifically define metabolic adaptation as having a reduced resting energy expenditure. So they weren't talking about, I'm going to sneeze.
Salud!
Excuse me. So they weren't talking about like this entire syndrome of all these different things and thyroid hormone and leptin and ghrelin. They were just looking at, is your resting metabolic rate lower than we would have predicted based on your body mass? So that's important. It was a very narrow definition of metabolic adaptation. Probably the second point, which is probably more important, is they had exactly 1 measurement in the study where the participants were actually supposed to be in neutral energy balance. They were eating at maintenance and supposed to be maintaining their weight exactly. And for that 1 measurement where that was true, they still found metabolic adaptation, even with their narrow definition. So the metabolic rate during that measurement was significantly lower than the predicted value. So even based on their very narrow definition and even based on their very narrow scope of when they think the measurement is truly valid, they still observed it. So I was really surprised by the choice of words in the title. But one thing that is, I think, there were a couple important things to take away from that paper. One is that energy expenditure, especially resting metabolic rate, is absolutely impacted by acute energy availability, or the acute energy balance that we find ourselves in. So if we're in a huge deficit, that's going to reduce resting metabolic rate. If we're overfeeding by 1,000 calories, you know, over the course of a huge meal, our energy expenditure is going to go up. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when you look at some of these papers about metabolic adaptation is, are the participants in the study in an energy deficit? Are they in an energy surplus? Those are going to impact our estimates. Another thing to keep in mind is, you know, I talked about non-exercise activity. The thermogenesis from non-exercise activity is the far more important aspect of energy expenditure that changes with metabolic adaptation. We do see some change in resting metabolic rate, but once we get rid of the energy deficit and we kind of put someone at maintenance, that reduction is only like 3 to 5% in most cases. There's some studies that show bigger reductions, some studies that show smaller, but it's generally 3 to 5% of resting metabolic rate. it's not a huge number. It's not something that we're really going to lose a lot of sleep over, not something that we're going to stress out about that much. I think when it comes to metabolic adaptation, the things we're most concerned about are my hormone levels back to normal? Is my total energy expenditure back to normal? Am I performing well in the gym? Am I recovering from workouts? Some of these other secondary aspects of metabolic adaptation as a comprehensive syndrome, we're not just worried about resting metabolic rate because it's frankly not that notable of an adaptation when we look at some of the other aspects of metabolic adaptation. So I thought it was a good study. I thought there were important things to take away from it, but I don't think I could possibly disagree more with the title.
Yes, and I guess when you're mentioning that there is more than just the resting metabolic rate, you want to look at the biofeedback, for example, when we're looking at hunger, cravings, energy, mood, like libido, like lots of different things that can tell you a little bit more in depth the big picture of how the person is adapting or how it's responding to the environment or the energy availability they have at that point in time. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's looking at, ultimately the reason I got into studying metabolic adaptation was, like I said, I did some bodybuilding competitions and I was like, man, really sucks getting lean. I wonder why that is. And so I was interested in the more comprehensive look at how the body adapts to really low energy availability and a large energy deficit and very low amounts of body fat, and the adaptations are so comprehensive. Like you said, low libido for female dieters, potentially disruption of the menstrual cycle. We talk about changes in hunger and appetite regulation, changes in psychological responses to feeding. It's so wide ranging and so comprehensive that to look at it as just resting metabolic rate, I think, is losing most of the actually impactful, important parts of what falls under that umbrella.
Yes, I agree. And I think a follow-up question about that is that when we're looking at the female triad, in your opinion, what could be the real cause of it? And I think this is trying to find out whether is it lack of chronic energy availability? Is it because there is a lot of exercise volume and stress from training? Is it lack of recovery? Is it all of them? What would be your take on that?
Yeah, my perspective is that when we look at the female athlete triad, or we look at relative energy deficiency in sport, which is the term a lot of people are moving toward, I think it really is essentially metabolic adaptation from a different perspective. So when we talk about metabolic adaptation, we're usually talking about weight loss being the end point, and it's usually in people that are just trying to get leaner. When we talk about relative energy deficiency in sport, we're talking about athletes who are doing exercise and the end point is performance. But we talk about a lot of the same things. These are very overlapping terms. We talk about how it affects reproductive hormones. We talk about how it affects food relationships and eating disorder prevalence and hunger regulation and all these different things. So they really are just two different perspectives of the same general problem, which is that when we have really low energy availability, the hypothalamus senses that, and we have a lot of issues related to that. And so insufficient caloric intake absolutely drives the female athlete triad. But of course, excessive exercise does as well, because both of those things can induce an energy deficit. So when we have someone on low calories and very high training volumes, that energy deficit gets even bigger. Okay, so those are basically two different sides of the same coin. And then when it comes to excessive training in general, even independent of a caloric deficit, or I guess I should say in conjunction with a caloric deficit, one of the things you find is that cortisol and leptin have an antagonistic relationship. When we have really high cortisol levels, that can actually reduce the action of leptin or the activity of leptin. So even if leptin is present in the blood, really high cortisol levels can influence with its ability to do its job. And so what we will find with usually when you talk about relative energy deficiency in sport, you're usually talking about a very lean endurance athlete in many cases. And so we're talking about somebody who is probably not eating enough to fuel their training, has a really high training volume, and they're in a big caloric deficit and they're already quite lean. And then on top of that, because there's a high training volume and insufficient energy intake and insufficient recovery between sessions, we'll find that we're driving an even greater divergence when we look at that relationship between cortisol and sex hormones. So the cortisol could be making things even a little bit worse. So yeah, it's probably all three of those things contributing, but I would look at relative energy deficiency in sport as basically being a special instance of metabolic adaptation. It's metabolic adaptation in a person who's doing a lot of exercise. Okay.
And if we were to define or like look at cortisol, is when we are like in a very stressful situation or chronic stress, would that sort of be the same in the sense of driving leptin on the opposite direction? So people are more prone to eat more. Is it the same, or is it a different perspective that you find?
Well, the relationship, the general relationship between cortisol and leptin doesn't care how either got there, so they're still going to have an antagonistic relationship. When it comes to chronic, like psychological stress, at that point, it just comes down to how high the cortisol gets and how chronically it's present. So the general relationship still exists. But then when it comes to, is that why we have stress eating? There are a lot of other psychological factors that really come into play with stress eating. It's not as simple as just, cortisol blocked your leptin, and now your satiety regulation and hunger regulation is out of whack. So it could play a role, but it's certainly not the only driver.
Okay, got it. Now we've got a question about thermic effect of feeding. I know we got a little bit out of that topic, but I think I wanted to sort of keep a follow-up on what we were speaking about. But going back to the thermic effect of feeding, which is one of the components that contributes to total energy expenditure, we know that depending on the macronutrient, we're going to find some of them will have a higher impact in TAF, but others will have less. Now, I wonder whether you can give me some take on what is the difference, or how the fiber, for example, and alcohol could have an impact on TEF, and why is that?
I mean, I could answer this question more generally. When we look at different macronutrients, when we look at carbohydrate, fat, protein, and then when we lump in ethanol or alcohol and fiber, these are all these different dietary components are going to have different impacts on our thermogenic response to eating. And that thermogenic response to intake of a nutrient is largely dictated by three factors. There's the ATP cost of digestion and absorption. There's the ATP cost of getting rid of any waste products that need to be excreted. And then there's the ATP cost of any processes that are stimulated by the ingestion of that nutrient. So for example, looking at carbohydrate or even something like caffeine, we see stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, which induces some processes that use up ATP. So ultimately, it comes down to, after we consume something, what kind of ATP cost is associated with that. And like I said, the body's got some very strict priorities. It's going to make sure we have enough ATP. So if we stimulate ATP production, we're going to have to break down some energy substrates, burn some calories in order to make that ATP production occur. And so you could look at any individual nutrient and say, within that framework, if we want to know why something has a high thermic effect, get out a biochemistry book and find the ATP consuming processes. I mean, it really is that simple. We need to figure out where's the ATP getting used when it goes from nutrient ingestion to digestion and absorption and waste product clearance. So, one of the reasons that I don't get too bogged down in kind of chasing, for something like alcohol, why is the thermic effect so high? I mean, it's in there, get the biochemistry book out, you can find it. But, when it comes to things like fiber and alcohol, the thermic effect is good to know, but that's not going to dictate our upper and lower boundaries of ethanol intake or fiber intake, right? So it's something that's good to know, but ultimately what dictates our fiber intake is going to be our GI comfort. You know, if we're too low or too high, that's going to have gastrointestinal ramifications. The fact that some of it's just going to show up in our diet because we're seeking important nutrients when we're bringing in more whole grain foods, bringing in more fruits and vegetables. And then, of course, if we start to let our fiber intake get too high, then we're going to have other GI discomfort associated with that. We might feel really bloated. Same thing with ethanol. No one's going to say, hey, I'm on a diet. I think I need to get more ethanol into my diet so that I can lose more weight because of the thermic effect of feeding. It's interesting to know about, but of course, the main thing that's going to limit our ethanol intake is those are really empty calories. You know, like some people don't really like the term empty calories, but ethanol is just pure energy and you're not getting any micronutrients. It's not doing anything helpful in terms of managing your satiety or hunger. It's not doing you any favors in terms of your sleep quality, your muscle protein synthesis rates. So, you know, you're not making your ethanol decisions based on the thermic effect of feeding. And I tell you what, if you really want to get some free calories out of it, you know, if you drink enough alcohol, the proportion that's excreted unmetabolized, I'm pretty sure goes up a little bit. So that's how I guess you get the most bang for your buck, but it's certainly not an advisable dietary strategy. But yeah, so it's always important to look at, or it's interesting to look at the thermic effect of different nutrients, but it doesn't really move the needle in terms of dictating which nutrients we're seeking out into the diet. We're focusing more on what's going to help me get micronutrients that I need, essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, what's going to help me perform well in the gym, and everything else kind of falls into place after that.
Yeah, I really like that answer and how you approach it. And I guess my question was going back to perhaps trying to understand why would be a very high TEF as compared to, like, if we were to compare the TEF of ethanol or fiber, that which tends to be about 20 to 30% versus like when we eat fats or carbohydrates, that tends to be much lower. So what would be the process that would be involved, like in the body, for it to be so expensive in terms of like the energy that your body has to expend to utilize or digest or transform that particular component into waste, or like get rid of it or utilize it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's, you know, pop open the biochemistry book. I mean, so like, for example, when we look at carbohydrate metabolism, you could go through each individual step of glycolysis and say, which one of these steps, there are multiple steps that involve ATP consuming processes. And then, I mean, you know, anyone that's taken nutritional biochemistry probably had to make all the flashcards and figure out, you know, which step uses ATP, which step creates ATP, which step creates other things that eventually become ATP and other processes. So they're out there. I don't have them memorized, and I don't, unless you're in medical school, I hope that you don't have them memorized either, because I don't know what you're going to do with that information.
Yeah, that's completely true. I guess what came to my mind when I thought about the thermic effect of feeding for alcohol was like, alcohol by itself is actually toxic for your liver. So how much work your liver actually have to do to get rid of it? I thought like that was my first association. Like the more alcohol you have, the more your liver have to work to get rid of it. So I guess it's just putting so much energy and all the work that the liver have to do to get rid of it. It was like, oh, it makes sense to be a high TF. Yeah,
and I mean, you know, ultimately, you know, the metabolism of alcohol occurs in the liver, and there's certainly enzymatic constraints on a lot of those reactions that occur. And you'd basically just look at the pathway of alcohol metabolism and say, within the liver, some of these require ATP and you know, the excretion of waste products and all that stuff. So yeah, it's just a matter when we look at, you know, which macronutrients have a high thermic effect, which ones don't. It just ultimately means that all of them have to go through a series of processes for digestion, absorption, waste product clearance, and things like that. For some of them, those processes involve ATP. For some of them, the ATP cost start to finish just simply isn't as high. And that's really the primary thing dictating that.
That's great. All right, I've got the last question for you, and we'll be able to wrap it up today. And this is about sports that need to cut weight to sort of get into the competition, or they have to, it's like a weight class. So my question here comes back to, usually from what I know, there are like certain two phases for this. Like generally you have the long-term phase where you sort of losing body fat in like a dieting phase. And then you have your peak week or your cutting phase, like your acute weight cutting. So my question is, what is your take on the time frames for these two phases? And my second question is, what are your recommendations for optimal manipulation of sodium, water, and carbs in that peak week? And is that the same as if we were talking about the peak week in a contest prep, or is it different?
Yeah, so starting with the first question, the overall time scale, we've got this long-term time scale and the short-term time scale. The short term, the timing of that is set, right? I mean, we're going to have a set time where we have to weigh in, and then we basically count back from there, you know, talking about a week or, you know, the last 4 or 5 days before weigh-in. That's where all the short-term magic is going to happen. The long-term time scale is where we actually have the ability to adjust the time frame. And I would actually recommend that when you're doing the long-term stuff, basically losing body fat to get within striking distance of your weight class, I think you can do that very strategically so that that weight loss is not occurring during the most important training sessions. You know, I've seen that with power lifters where the last, you know, month before the meet, their last mesocycle where they're doing their most important training, they're in a huge calorie deficit during those weeks. And I think if you can avoid that, it would be ideal. So do that cut a few, you know, a couple or a few months before so that you can actually really fuel those workouts that are most critical in that month leading up to competition. I remember back in the day, I was a competitive wrestler. And, you know, there were some people in the wrestling world who during the season, it was like, you're not even focused on being a wrestler. You're like a professional weight loser, you know. It, like, the practice was about achieving a caloric deficit. Practice was not about refining my technique in the sport that I perform in. And that's not what you want to do in that critical time leading up to competition. So I would always, you know, advise to wrestlers in the United States, wrestling occurs in the winter months, so that the season really ramps up in like November, December. I'd say lose your weight during the fall, lose it in October, November, you know, September, October, November, and then throughout the actual season, you can focus on your sport. Just focus on being an athlete. We'll do the short-term manipulation when we need to, but get down to your actual, you know, wrestling weight or competition weight earlier so that we don't have to focus on losing fat during our most important training sessions. Now, when it comes to the actual adjustments, like for peak week or leading up to a weigh-in, I don't like to make huge adjustments unless we absolutely have to. So like I coach people that do powerlifting competitions pretty frequently. And I generally say, let's not do a water cut unless we need to. And, you know, who would need to? Let's say you're 3 or 4 pounds above the weight class and you think you can go and, you know, win nationals or get a medal at nationals or set a record that's important to you. Then yeah, there's a competitive advantage to doing that, and it makes sense. The stakes are high enough that we would say, okay, let's introduce all these variables and risk the fact that you might underperform. Because that's ultimately what you're signing up for. There's risk and reward. And when you start messing around with hydration status and electrolyte status and, you know, short-term weight reductions, it's possible you could show up on the platform and just really not have your best lifts. So we only want to introduce all that variability when we must, and when the stakes are high enough to really make that a defensible decision. If you are going to go that route, I try to keep it pretty simple. I don't like to make huge, drastic weight reductions. So anything over 2% of body weight starts to make me a little bit nervous, just because I don't like it. Now, usually early in the week, we're talking about doing some water loading within reason, nothing too extreme, but just a little bit more water intake than normal. And then the day before weigh-ins, you might do a bit of a water cut. And of course, you always want to keep health the top priority. You want to be safe, but you can adjust fluid intake within safe ranges. Have some higher fluid intake early in the week, drop it off the day before the weigh-in. A day or two before weigh-in, you might go on a low residue diet, keep your fiber low. It's going to help reduce the bulk of content in the GI tract, which counts in the weigh-in. And then, people have used hot baths or saunas to do a little bit more extra sweating the day before weigh-in, just so that they don't have to be doing cardiovascular exercise and actually inhibiting their recovery in order to induce some weight loss. So I'm going to sneeze again. Excuse me. I was really rolling there. I had a lot of momentum. I must have allergies. So those are the strategies, right? You do a little bit of water loading, then some water reduction. When it comes to, you asked about electrolytes, so sodium and potassium, I really don't like to mess with sodium and potassium too much. I know some people get really creative with it. They drop off the sodium really hard. They ramp up the potassium. If you're not careful, that can be a really dangerous practice. And I don't want anything to do with that. I want any athlete I'm working with to be safe and healthy and also perform well. We never get those priorities out of order. So I've been to bodybuilding competitions where I'm backstage. And by the way, I should be clear, for bodybuilding, I basically don't do any of this. I've tried to do some peak week stuff that's really creative, and I've hated all of it. My physique looks best when I just show up and compete. I increase my carbohydrate a little bit, but not much, and that's literally it. For bodybuilding, I don't change sodium, I don't change potassium, I don't change water intake. I just show up with normal human blood levels of sodium, potassium in a hydrated state, and if you're lean enough, you're going to look really good. So I don't like to get creative for bodybuilding. The times I've tried, I looked way better 3 days before competition. So, but for powerlifting, for weight class sports, those are the things you can do. But even when I'm doing that stuff, I just leave sodium and potassium alone. I keep those intakes as consistent as I can throughout the process, and that's it.
What about carbohydrates? Because obviously carbohydrates, when you eat carbohydrates, your body synthesizes glycogen, and glycogen can drag water with it. So it might make a difference when it comes to weighing for a certain sport, or even like look better in stage, like more vascular, better, like physically much better. So what would be your take on carbohydrate manipulation in that big week?
Yeah, I totally forgot to mention carbohydrates. So thank you for bringing that up. So carbohydrate, absolutely. If we're trying to make weight for a weight class sport, I do reduce carbohydrate in the days leading up to the weigh-in. And toward the end, the last day or two, it probably is going to get very low, especially if we have plenty of time between the weigh-in and competition. If we have an opportunity to replenish glycogen, we will manipulate that and drop that off over the course of the week and eventually get quite low if we need to. Because like you were saying, we can reduce storage of muscle and liver glycogen. That's going to reduce total body water. That's going to be a helpful part of the process, no question. So when it comes to making weight in a weight class sport, it's that simple. We scale the carbohydrate down over the course of that final week. The last 2 or 3 days, it'll probably be pretty low, and we'll replenish it after the weigh-in. When it comes to bodybuilding, I know some people that really like to do loading with carbohydrate. They like to really cut the carbs throughout the early part of peak week and then ramp it up later in peak week. Some of them even move the process earlier. So they'll do some they call it front loading early in peak week. They'll start ramping their carbs up just so that they have a better idea of how they're responding to the carbs. I've tried both. I prefer to do back loading. So the early part of peak week, I'll keep my carbs low. And if I'm going to do any carb manipulation, I'll add it toward the end of the week, the last couple of days before competition. But I do it very, very modestly. I don't do aggressive increases in carbohydrate intake, just because, like I said, I don't like the way I look when I try it. I usually find that I have a lot of subcutaneous fluid retention. I just don't look great. So some people do really aggressive carb loading, and the idea is it's going to increase glycogen content of their muscle tissue. It's going to make their muscles look larger. And so I understand the theoretical rationale, but in practice, some people do great with it. I know Peter Fitchen and Cliff Wilson, they really like doing the super high carb intakes for a lot of their, not all, but for a lot of their competitors, and they've got great success with it. But I've talked with Peter about this, and I was like, Peter, I've tried this several times and it sucks. It just doesn't work for me. And he's like, dude, I've got clients for which that's true, and we just don't mess around with it. So for me personally, I don't mess around with it much. And with a particular client, if you're trying to decide, should we mess around with it, try it earlier. Don't do it, for the first time when they're about to get on stage. Try a simulated peak week, see if they respond well to that big carb influx. If they do, great, use it. If not, just realize that not everyone has to do really aggressive carb loading to look, full and musculature and lean on stage. Okay.
And a follow-up question, do you think that, especially in a weight class sport, cutting carbohydrates leading up to the weigh-in could affect their performance in their competition? Like, especially if we're talking about wrestling or something that actually involves more like very intense exercise, very intense movements. Do you find that potential cut of carbohydrates leading up to the competition could affect their performance, even if they have time to sort of eat a big meal of carbohydrates after the weigh-in? Would it be enough to sort of replenish all the glycogen stores and have adequate performance?
Yeah, it depends on two things. First of all, how glycolytic is the sport? And second of all, how much time do you have between weigh-in and competition? If you have a 24-hour gap between weigh-in and competition, you can replenish a whole lot of glycogen. And of course, if your sport isn't that glycolytic in nature, if you're doing powerlifting, we don't really need 100% glycogen repletion in order for us to go perform well. So if you have 24 hours, or if you're doing a sport that's not heavily glycolytic, you should be fine. If you have a short time, if you have an hour or two between weigh-in and competition, and it's a highly glycolytic sport, you might want to be more conservative about how much weight you're cutting, or how much carbohydrate depletion you utilize in your weight cut. And one kind of special case of that, I mentioned my background as an athlete was in wrestling. Now, if you're good enough to be worried about weight cutting, I hope that you're going to go into the competition and have some important matches at the end of the day, right? So if you're going into a tournament and you're the top seed, your first match or two should be pretty easy. You should be favored to win those matches. And so if I'm working with a wrestler, for example, who's in a tournament, and we know that their first two matches are going to be easy and their third and fourth are where they really need their best stuff, we can probably get plenty of carbohydrate replenishment by the second, third, and especially the fourth match. And the fourth match for most tournaments is going to be at the end of the day, and it's going to be the championship, right? And so if I'm working with someone and they're going to go into a tournament and they're favored to get, beat pretty bad in the first match early in the tournament, then I would question, why are we focusing so much on weight reduction if we're not going to really go out into this tournament and be highly competitive and challenge for the championship? Now, if it's a different tournament format and you might have your hardest match first, obviously that's a different scenario. So it really comes down to timing. And how much glycogen replenishment can we do in an hour or two? Not that much. How much can we do in 6 hours? More. How much can we do in 24 hours? A ton. So you have to contextually weigh those factors.
That's awesome. Eric, I appreciate so much you came along. We have an amazing conversation. I enjoy every single minute of this conversation. So thank you so much. Where could people find you in addition to your Instagram? Where else can people get you?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It was great to meet you. I really enjoyed it. I also saw a comment about my Ohio State mug. Go Bucks. Now, if people want to get in touch with me, Instagram's a good place to do it, but of course you can find me at strongerbyscience.com. And if you go there, you can find our podcast that comes out every 2 weeks. You can find our research review called Mass. Strongerbyscience.com would be the place to go.
Awesome. One more question to wrap it up. And this is just like, what would be your few last tips for someone who wants to be out of that 95% of people that fail their diet, like these 5%ers? What are your best tips for them to sort of succeed in that weight maintenance and the diet after the diet?
Yeah, so there's research on this. We've got the national registry for people who have really successfully maintained their weight loss. And the things that seem to be associated with successful weight maintenance seem to be very detailed tracking. So continuing to track your diet, continuing to track your body weight, continuing to track your steps per day, tracking and staying on top of those numerical values is important and seems to be correlated with successful maintenance of weight loss. The other thing seems to be just keeping your physical activity level high. So those two things together really seem to be critically important.
That's awesome. Well, Eric, thank you again so much for having this time and hanging out with me and with everyone else that tune in. And I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. And man, there's a lot of Ohio State Buckeyes in the comments there. I love it. It's good stuff. You got a good audience.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Eric, so much. I will see you very soon.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.